much. Thanks for having me, and thank you so much for everybody for joining in. May I start sharing my screen?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi. So I'd like to start actually with a big confession. I'm here a bit under false pretenses. I'm not a historian. I'm not an urban planner. I don't even have a real eye for architecture. So, and I've also gone through my life in Colaba, and I've lived here now almost all my 50 years, uh, you know, without really wondering what Colaba used to be, without trying to unearth the past or unearth its stories. For me, the Colaba that I lived in was pretty much what we see around us every day. Leopold Cafe, junk jewelry, hawkers, and I'll just show you a tiny video if it plays. Is the sound sharing? So the story of how I discovered Colaba and the stories of Colaba began actually when I met an editor of mine. She had come to talk to me about one of the Nimmi books that I was writing. And it so happens that Nimmi in the imaginary world is also a resident of a part of Colaba or Cuff Parade. And Nimmi is a little schoolgirl who gets into plenty of scrapes. And we were plotting and planning the next scrapes that she would get into. And towards the end of our lunch, my editor turned around and said, we are doing a series of neighborhood books. Will you do one? And I reeled back and said, no, I write for children. I know nothing about neighborhoods. I don't want to do this. 10 minutes later, I left the cafe with a heavy feeling in my heart and a new project on my hands, a book on Colaba. And I had decided that I would go home and email my editor and tell her that I really couldn't handle it. But then I started a little bit of investigation and a little bit of reading up. And I realized that the neighborhood that I live in had so many more layers than what meets the eye. And I think as I started reading even the most basic stories, I decided that this was something I had to write. And I think through my journey, reading and writing about Colaba, I realized a number of things. I realized that as a people, we forget really, really quickly. The story of Colaba is just really about 300 years old, but it is something we have all forgotten. We have all remembered and forgotten repeatedly. The other thing that I realized, which is for me really interesting, is that there is no one story of any neighborhood. The histories of, I think, many neighborhoods across the world are all tangled up together, a bit like a glob of overcooked spaghetti. All the stories are merged and they all are a big lump. And when you try to trace a single strand, you end up finding that you cannot pull out a single strand without looking at the history of all the other strands, some of which may be in Afghanistan, some of which may be in the US, some of which may be in another corner of Mumbai or India. So when I started my research on Colaba, my first question, the big challenge that came to me was, what really is Colaba? And being a journalist, before I was a children's writer, I was a journalist. I did what a journalist would. I approached the BMC, then I approached the police, then I approached the post office. But at every point, the answers I got were inadequate and not very accurate. Because their Colaba and my Colaba didn't seem to merge. And at that point, I decided, okay, Bombay was 7 islands. One of the islands was Colaba. So let me do the simple thing. Let me find the island of Colaba and then let me look beneath the cement, beneath the buildings, beneath the shops named Gypsy Rose and Amazing Fast Food and Oh Fudge and all those other modern entrance into my neighborhood, and let me find that old island. This sounds simple, but very honestly, it was far from simple. I think my first so I started, as all new researchers would, with that most amazing book, The Gazetteer of Bombay. And the Gazetteer gave me the picture of Bombay that I had grown up with, that all of you have grown up with. 7 islands, marshy Parel, rocky Worli, prosperous Mahim with its Dargah and its Prabha Devi temple. Um, then the big H-shaped island of Bombay that we can see here, little Mazgaon at the side, and then at the very tail, Colaba and Old Woman's Island. So far, so good. I started then looking at maps, and the first map I found rather vaguely said Bombay as it was supposed to be in the around 1670. And this is the map I think that we all look at when we think about the history of the city. The 7 islands were there and perfectly fit with my preconceived notions. Which is why, when I looked at the next map, I was in for a rude shock. The next map that I looked at was a map that was drawn in 1672 by a doctor called John Fryer. Now, John Fryer worked with the East India Company and he fancied himself a bit of a globe-trotter. So he kept a diary and he did little maps of wherever he went. His map of Bombay also showed 7 islands. But the really peculiar part of it was that the 7 islands that he showed had nothing to do with the 7 islands of the earlier map. His 7 islands included Henry Kennery, included Elephanta, included something called Butcher's Island, which was what the Portuguese used to call Putachos, or Island of Melons, and was a place where all the rich Portuguese loved to have little summer bungalows. So what had happened? I could not understand how to put these two conflicting maps together. The map that he showed, Bombay is one big blob of land, and then it has a tiny tail, which is Old Woman's Island and Colaba. Why would the two maps, supposedly just 2 years apart, be so different? And I think it took a lot of reading up to understand that, again, the geography of any place depends also on its history. And in this case, the history that took place when two rich and royal people decided to get married. This is King Charles II, and this is Catherine of Braganza. And as we all know, Bombay went to England when Catherine married Charles. The story of their marriage is also quite an amusing one. Charles was a skirt chaser, a distracted ruler, and an impoverished ruler. So, though he wanted a pretty and fairly luscious bride, his advisors were made it clear to him that what he really had to end up with was a rich bride. Which is how he ended up marrying Catherine of Braganza, though the official letters say that she was quite short and quite buck-toothed. He ended up with her and he sort of gloomily accepted his fate. Catherine brought with her a dowry that the British were very excited about, and the dowry included Tangiers and Bombay. At first, the British had bargained for Goa, but the Portuguese whittled them down, and the British were quite content, and Lord Clarendon at that point famously exulted, we are getting this beautiful town of Bombay, which is near Brazil and is full of castles and wealth. When the English actually arrived, a poor, ill-fated gentleman named Abraham Shipman, who was to come and take over as governor of Bombay, they were in for a rude shock. Abraham Shipman and his 400 men, when they arrived, they were given the nastiest of welcomes. The Portuguese were already settled in Bombay. They were comfortable. They were playing top dog. They were really happy with everything that they had around them. They absolutely did not want to give up their homes and their top dog status just because a princess in Portugal had married a prince in England. It just didn't make any sense to them. And so they were most unwelcoming. There were a series of mishaps. First, Abraham Shipman's boat went astray. So they would not hand over the island to anybody else. Then he finally arrived, and they still were difficult about it. And then they pushed him off to an island off the coast of Karnataka to wait while they figured things out. And a year later, of the 400 men who had arrived with Abraham Shipman, only 140 men remained. The rest had died of disease and debauchery and too much alcohol. Quite a sad story. Then Abraham Shipman died. But fortunately for the British, Abraham Shipman had a very wily and clever secretary called Humphrey Cook. And Humphrey Cook took matters into his own hands and insisted on getting Bombay. Now, the big problem was, what was Bombay? The Portuguese insisted that Bombay was just that single central H-shaped island. Nothing more, nothing less. The English were, as it is, really upset by the paltry little island that they had arrived in, and they were absolutely unwilling to give up Mahim and Parel and the rest of this cluster of islands. So there was a big conflict of definition. And to compound matters, Charles II, being distracted and being interested in totally other matters, had lost the map that had come along with the contract. Humphrey Cook insisted that Bombay was anything that he could walk on land. And in low tide, when the water receded, he actually managed to walk from the island of Bombay to the island of Worli and the island of Mahim and said, "This is mine, this is mine, this is mine." The Portuguese, on the other hand, insisted that anything that you required a boat to travel, for example, if you needed to go from one place to another by boat in high tide, then that was an island. So they insisted that all they had to hand over was the H-shaped island. Finally, it was a couple of years later that Humphrey Cook finally stepped onto the land of Bombay. He made a big show of it, kissing the land and holding the walls. But all he got at that point was that H-shaped island. But slowly, by the end of it all, he had managed to get Mahim, Parel, Mazgaon, Bombay, and Worli. The only two bits of land that nobody fought over and that everybody accepted were islands, were the island of Colaba and the little which is at the very tip that you can see, and a little mound of land in the middle that was called Old Woman's Island. And why do you think that nobody was squabbling over this? For the simple reason that they were such outposts, such sort of impractical clunks of land that if the Portuguese had Salsette in the north, they had to give away the 5 islands in the middle, and so they had little need or desire for those 2 islands right at the bottom. And so they continued holding on to these islands, but there was not much activity till later British Governor General came and signed a treaty with them and took over these 2 islands. The island of Colaba was so called because it seems to have been a Coley hamlet. That's all we really know about it at that point. And the name comes from there. The name Old Woman's Island is, of course, a much more promising and intriguing name, but quite sad. And there were all these theories about how it was named after a harlot, named after an angry goddess. But I am quite disappointed to have to admit that the real reason was a much more pedestrian one. It's named after the Portuguese name of Al-Omani, which was named after the fishermen who went further into the sea, further towards Oman. And the British, in their typical way, mispronounced it and made it Old Woman's Island. Anyway, so these were the only 2 undisputed plots of land. Now, where exactly did Colaba begin and where did it end? The answer to this question was also a bit of a shock. The southern end of Colaba is Prongs Reef. And you can see the absolute tip of it, it's Prongs Lighthouse. And if you go to US Club or the very tip of Nariman Point, you can see it. It's a beautiful lighthouse, actually, with wooden floored living room where apparently wonderful dances were held. And it once even had a cannon to fight off the pirates that never came. Where is the northern part of Colaba Island? Colaba Island actually ends at Sassoon Dock. So which is much more south than any of us would expect in our modern day understanding of the city. Between Sassoon Dock and Old Woman's Island was a narrow channel of water that got filled at some point of time. And Old Woman's Island was like a little hillock, a little blob of land with a village that Lord Nelson mentions in his memoirs. And it is, I think, approximately where Colaba Bazaar is today. And the area called Pachpairi, a little slight mound rising up. Old Woman's Island ended near Colaba police station, which, if any of you are familiar with Colaba Causeway, is about in the middle of Colaba Causeway, just after Electric House. How do we know this? We know this because in Colaba police station, there is a temple called the Khada Devi Mandir. And the Khada Devi Mandir has been taken over by this family called the Shirsagars. They've happily taken away this plot of land, built their house, taken the Khada Devi temple, and they claim that they are the traditional keepers of the temple. And in their little compound, there is a stone, a tiny stone that you can see, which states that the ferry that connected Old Woman's Island to the island of Bombay began here. So the people wanting to move from Old Woman's Island to the island of Bombay went into this ferry here and had to cross all the way to through a substantial creek. Now, so this is what Colaba used to be in the 1600s and entering the 1700s. In the 1700s, Colaba was a really sleepy place, a place where, unfortunately, we have very few records of. This is a view of the city of Bombay seen from Mazgaon. So if you look at the very tip right over here, this part is Colaba, and you can tell that there's not much going on in Colaba at that point. Again, you can see Colaba in the background, very quiet and idyllic kind of situation. Now, the earliest account that we have of Colaba is by a soldier, a mercenary called John Burnell, who was working for the East India Company. Luckily for us, he was a devoted son and wrote 2 huge letters home that have survived the test of time. And John Burnell wrote, in one of the letters to his father, he wrote a lot about Colaba. He mentioned that Colaba, I'm just going to read that bit so you get a flavor of his writing. He wrote that the length is near 2 miles and the breadth is hardly 1.25 miles of dry ground, though on the west side is much mangrove and rocky land, which stretch it out near 3/4 mile into the sea, visible at low water. He mentioned a steep and rugged hill, a large grove of coconut trees, and 3 kilns of chunam made from shell. He doesn't talk about the people who lived here, the ones who plucked the coconut from the tree, the ones who ran the kilns. But what he does mention is that when he went to measure these islands, he was greeted by about 50 jackals who sort of lurked the area, and he tried to shoot them, but they were faster than the wind, and he didn't manage to kill a single jackal. The only other thing that he really mentions about Colaba are these 2 white tombs rising up to the sky. If any of you have seen the Colaba police station, the Colaba bus station and Colaba post office area, they're cluttered areas filled with buildings, filled with hawkers, filled with shops. But in those days, they were silent, green hillsides rocky, mangrovey, infested with jackals, of course, and with these two tall white structures. One was the tomb of Sir John Child, who was one of the earlier governors of the city. And John Child was a very unfortunate governor. He got into trouble in a number of ways. When the Siddhi generals started to attack Bombay, he was the poor man who had to strike a deal with the Mughals, and was very mortified by it. To compound matters, he got caught in a really nasty and typically Bombay scandal of corruption when the St. Thomas Cathedral was being built. And so the story goes that he more or less died of shame. He was buried in lonely Colaba in this white tomb. And close enough, there was another tomb called the Moors Sepulchre, or the Musalman's tomb, which was another white, tall structure. Why are these structures important? For a very strange reason. Bombay, as you know, was blessed with this absolutely fabulous, and still is blessed with this absolutely fabulous harbour. The problem was that before the sailors could reach the harbour, they had to navigate the strip of rocks that go from Colaba, from mainland Colaba to where we now have Prong's lighthouse, but there was no lighthouse then. So how did the sailors know where to make that turn? There were meticulous instructions given and to navigators who were coming into Colaba, and these rocks, they involved 7 trees and these 2 tombs. And the sailors were told that they had to keep the tombs in a specific direction in their line of vision compared to Malabar Hill and compared to the trees. And then they had to take a deep breath, hope for the best, and make that turn. Not everybody managed. And Bombay saw a number of shipwrecks, many of which still lie beneath our waters. The most horrific shipwreck was the shipwreck that involved not 1, but 2 ships. The Lord William Bentinck was approaching Bombay. It was just before the monsoon. The seas were rough, and the ship was trying to take the turn, but was being thrown about by the winds. What complicated matters was that the navigators were getting frantic, and one day they just decided to jumped into and tried to make the turn into the harbour and smashed straight into Prong's Reef. It was a horrendous situation because the ship had over 200 people, and the ship was slowly sinking. Now nighttime approached, and the Lord Castlereagh was approaching as well. When the Lord Castlereagh finally approached, it saw the lights of the William Bentinck, and mistook the lights of William Bentinck for the harbour, and so merrily sailed towards it and smashed straight into the Prong's Reef as well. As you can imagine, it was a ghastly situation because William Bentinck and Castlereagh were full ships with about 400, 500 people in toto. The ships were slowly sinking. The William Bentinck was desperately trying, the boats were trying to get people off. People began to jump from the Bentinck and made their way to the Castlereagh. First the William Bentinck sank, and then the Castlereagh sank. And there are first-person accounts of the situation all over Colaba where, people's clothes, people's possessions, and arms and legs were floating around in the water. And of course, the British, being the British, could not refrain from a little happy exoticism. So there is the story of this Nawab's daughter who stood on the Castlereagh begging and pleading to be saved. And she promised her entire fortune and her hand in marriage to any man who could save her. And sadly for the men, they weren't able to save her, and they weren't able to save themselves. And dozens hundreds of people, we don't have an exact count, but hundreds and hundreds did die. And we know that at least 180 did die because in the old cemetery that existed at the very tip of Colaba, where US Club stands today. There was a single grave with 180 bodies from this particular shipwreck. So in the 1700s, when people approached Bombay, this is approximately what they saw. This is a later picture, so there are more structures than what they must have seen. All accounts agree on one thing, that Bombay was an extraordinarily beautiful city. And you will have many books of that era where there are discussions between people and they will say, no, we feel Bali is more beautiful or Java is more beautiful. But generally it is agreed that Bombay is the most beautiful. And when they arrived, there was one thing that till the mid 1700s, they all could see. And that was a really notorious cemetery called Mendham's Point. So as the ships approached, they could see Mendham's Point towards right in front of them, which was not the most auspicious welcome to Bombay. Mendham's Point was possibly the most notorious cemetery in all the British Empire. It had these 140 tombs. Some were very fancy with pyramids and spires and domes and it was where the Governor General's wives were buried. And then there were these tiny little tombs where all the writers of the East India Company were just shoved. And there was one tomb which housed an entire regiment. And the British, when they arrived in Bombay, one didn't do well. There are many accounts of how these poor young soldiers and administrators arrived and didn't even survive long enough to write their first letter home. And there are amazing accounts by various Britishers, including a chaplain called Ovington, who writes about when he arrived by his ship within a month or 2 months, 35 of his shipmates had been buried. And he writes that the climate here in this accursed city is particularly terrible for infants. And he talks about toads the size of, rabbits, literally. So it was, in a way, a scary city to be a part of. And Mendham's Point was insatiable and seemed to absorb huge number of people who arrived there. In the 1700s, Mendham's Point was demolished and it was more or less forgotten except in the accounts. Nobody really knew where it was. Then in the 1900s, later, the Alfred Seaman's Rest was built here as a rest house for sailors, British sailors. It continued later when it was being expanded and being made into the Legislative Council. Sorry, there was a lot of work going on, and terrified workmen started, as they were digging, finding bone upon bone upon bone. And there is a fabulous report in the Times of India about these workmen who were frightened and terrified that the spirits would attack them, put down their tools and ran away. But of course, they were persuaded to continue working, and they did continue working. But every time you round Regal Circle, please remember that you are probably treading on the souls and bones of innumerable young lives. And at least now, whenever I pass, I kind of give a thought to all those people who were buried here. Young, old, tiny, all kinds of people. And it's actually strange that there are no more ghosts around here than the few that we know about. So in a sense, this is the Bombay to which people arrived. This is a scene as far as 1880. So of course, it's much later than the time that I'm talking about, but it gives you a sense of the city as it was. In the 1700s, when people arrived at the port near Apollo Bandar, they came and they would weave their way past bales of cotton and bundles of opium. And it was so flat that they could literally see across to the sea at the other end, the part that is now, Old Cuff Parade and Back Bay Reclamation. There was nothing to block their way. It's one more image, old image of Apollo Bandar, just so you can time travel a bit. It was in the late 1700s and the early 1800s that Colaba started picking up speed. In the late 1700s, so Colaba for a long time was used only for the military. And it was used as a place where the military went. It was used more for recuperation when they were ill. In the late 1700s, it was noticed that when the military was stationed in Colaba, they were much healthier and drank much less and did something which is mysteriously described as indulged in more manly pursuits when they lived in Colaba, when they were stationed in Colaba. So the higher-ups in the army and the navy requested that Colaba be then sort of be made to be a proper military station, and that is where the story of Colaba really begins. At this point, so what happened was the military was stationed there, and of course, this being Bombay and Mumbaikars of all stripes are pretty much alike. There was a man named General Washington who started encroaching upon land and built 3 illegal bungalows. And so that is where the civilians started staying, as well as a few others. Now, other than that, there were not too many people who wanted to be in Colaba. And when you read the early accounts of Colaba, it's really not a very happening place, or not a place you would want to be a part of. So basically, all early newspaper reports which involve Colaba will involve things like snakes, dead sharks, tigers, and other such undesirables, as well as a lot of crime. So there was a gang of robbers that functioned here, which were called the Bandar gang. And they would sail around in little boats and throw sort of weapons at other boats in the area and then rob them, to the extent that the police actually had to have a floating Colaba force to tackle crime in the area. The other accounts, there was also a lot of terrestrial crime. And there is a very cute story about a Mrs. Sparrow who was riding along with her coachman, I think from Sunday service or some such other noble activity, when an Armenian bandit caught her and shot off the poor coachman's ear. So typically that was the reputation of Colaba. And otherwise, the other kind of people who stayed here were people who were pretty reclusive, who didn't really want to cross to the mainland, to the bars and the pubs and the gaiety of the mainland. And this was largely because of that big creek that separated Colaba from the Colaba police station up to Mendham's Point and the museum. And it really put a crimp in people's social lives, because it was possible to gallop across by horse, but sometimes the tides would come in with such fury that either you turned back or you pretty much died and had a horrible accident. And there are a number of interesting accounts about those days, and I'm trying to find one account which is written by a man named Henry Moses, who has actually written a lot of really interesting and salacious gossip about the Bombay of those days. So Henry Moses has written about this little romance, and because it is so amusing and sad and sweet, I will read it out to you. A melancholy and romantic story is still told of Colaba. A young girl of the Mohammedan faith was on her road to pay a visit to some natives who resided in Colaba, and having arrived in her bullock gari, just when the tide was rising in the place, she thought that as the water was not deep, she might cross without danger, and ordered her driver to order the timid bullocks across the stream. He did so, but before they had proceeded many yards, the animal became restive and obstinate and refused to go one way or another. The wheels became entangled among the rough stones. The gari was upset, and the poor girl, being thrown into the rapidly increasing current, was swept out into Back Bay. The scene was witnessed, most fortunately, from the Colaba side, by an Englishman who had, up to the moment, been a passive spectator. In an instant, his coat was off, and he was breasting the foaming tide after the drowning girl, when, at the risk of his own life, he succeeded in bringing safety, whom he brought safely to the shore. He accompanied her home to Bombay, where he received the thanks and benedictions of her parents. Strange to say, though not more strange than true, an attachment sprang up between the young Englishman and the Hindu lady. At this point, I must say that the girl started out being a Muslim, but somewhere along the way became a Hindu, but never mind, whom he had rescued from a watery grave. And many were said to be the private meetings that took place between the two lovers, unknown, of course, to the unsuspecting parents. At length, the Englishman thought that his religion would be, though the Englishman knew that his religion would be an impenetrable objection, he was determined to solicit her hand. The Mohammedan girl's family did not take well to this. Again, she's become a Muslim, so we are still a bit bewildered. But the Englishman persevered. The haughty man of high caste at once indignantly refused the fair Englishman, but the Englishman could never be one of his people, and he bade him to depart in peace. The sequel was very sad. The Hindu maiden disappeared. Rumors were current in Bombay that she had been privately murdered by her enraged relatives. The Englishman committed suicide. What happened to the bullocks and the coachman is not known. Anyway, everything changed for Colaba in 1938. And it changed because of a single strip of land called, any guesses? Called Colaba Causeway. This is the image of the Colaba Causeway being built. So this single strip of land connected the mainland, or the museum, where we see the museum today, with the rest of Colaba, and continued as a road down Old Woman's Island and into the island of Colaba. As you can imagine, overnight, from being sort of an outpost, a land of bandits, a place where nobody wanted to go, a place where Parsi women, if they had to go to the Agyari at Afghan church, would not wear a single bit of jewelry, Colaba suddenly became accessible, and it suddenly became prime real estate. And the canny businessmen of the city immediately decided that this was something that they should be looking at. Did they build their mansions here? Did they build their bungalows here? No. They were perfectly happy being in Malabar Hill and in Masgao and in Parel. What they did, however, decide was that this was the absolute perfect place for their factories. And overnight, Colaba became pretty much the armpit of the city. There is an account from the late 1800s by very famous Maharashtrian writer about the city, Mumbai Varnan, and he describes Colaba as a ghastly place, a sort of a Dickensian hellhole. He talks about a place where coal is stored in warehouses, where factories keep on chuntering day and night, where a dark building where military men who have committed offenses are punished. And generally, it's the kind of place you wouldn't want to go, and nor would I. In the 1840s, what happened to change Colaba? This is an incredible story that, in a way, connects our lives with lives across the globe. Up to the 1840s, the cotton green of Mumbai was situated at Elphinstone Circle, the place we know as Horniman Circle land of Starbucks and land of designer luggage and designer bags and Yazdani bakery, yummy brun bread. But in those days, it was the absolute hub of the city. And other than that, it was cotton green. The Times of India of those days was packed with angry letters from people who were stuck in the traffic because there was a big discussion about how much a particular cotton bale was going to be bought and sold for. And so all traffic stopped. The situation was ridiculous, and it was finally agreed that the cotton green had to move. Colaba became the obvious place to move the cotton green because it was close to the port, it had empty land, and it was absolutely ideal in many ways. And that is where the cotton green came. If any of you have walked on Colaba Causeway, and I really feel that this should not be a talk, this should actually be a walk around Colaba, because if you go to Electric House and then start walking towards Strand Cinema and Kailash Parbat and Colaba Bazaar, that entire stretch was actually a cotton green. And if you see this picture, the building at the back is Grant's building, which is today on Arthabanda Road, the road leading up from Colaba Causeway to Radio Club. And it was a big, huge building. And the entire area in front of it was the cotton green. And this is... So this was an area of cotton bales, of a scatter of warehouses, of constant bargaining. Now, in 1861, something happened that changed the world. In 1861, the northern states of America and the southern states of America plunged into this great civil war over slavery.
Shabnam?
Yes?
You wanted to be reminded at 6:45. So
oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, we are only halfway. I will hurry. Okay.
No, please take your time. And you're just saying so because you wanted a reminder at that time. But this is really very interesting.
I'm really glad that you reminded me. Thank you. Now, the southern states of America declared war, not just in a regular way, but by burning a huge number of tons and tons of cotton. It was their way of blackmailing the world and telling the world that you better support us, otherwise you guys are going to be starved of cotton. The world didn't succumb because the world believed that slavery was a wrong thing. The English mills especially were huge and perpetually hungry for cotton. England frantically started looking for alternate sources of cotton, and they finally alighted upon two countries, Egypt and India. And the cotton green of Bombay, the cotton green of Colaba became the place of frantic transactions. Transactions so crazy that when you read Dinsha Vacha's famous accounts about it, he talks about people literally dragging their mattresses to this cotton green, ripping the mattresses apart and selling handfuls of cotton. 80 million pounds entered the city during the 4 years of the American Civil War. And all of a sudden, from being an ordinary little corner of the city, of the empire, Bombay became this rich and amazing place. And this entire part of Colaba was unrecognizable. This is Colaba station. So the trains used to bring the cotton all the way from the middle of India to Colaba. And this is where Badwar Park is now in Back Bay, early part of Cuff Parade. This was Colaba railway station. The trams were next door. And the entire area was a traffic jam of bullock carts and little mounds of bullock potty. So in this book, I actually write, don't keep hankering for the good old days. The good old days weren't actually that sweet smelling. And every account you read of those days, there is talk of how people's shoes got messed up because of the little mounds of bullock droppings. Anyway, this where we see Khushrobagh today, a large part of it was the railway yard. So the entire area was devoted to cotton. Bullock carts, railway yards, cotton green, and factories. There were, of course, the factories in the area. If you go into Badwar Park ever, you will see this baobab tree, which is the one sort of landmark that remains of the old Colaba station. And personally, it is just a beautiful tree. So just go and stand under it and look at the sky through the branches. It is magical. And I'm so happy that for once we've done the right tree and kept a tree, the right thing, and kept a tree rather than any other monstrous memento. Anyway, the money that came in from the cotton, a lot of it went into reclaiming land across the city, including Colaba. Around the 1860s, there was a need for a cotton warehouse. So while they were reclaiming land for the warehouse near the bandar, they said, chalo, let us reclaim a little more land. And they ended up reclaiming a full 40 acres, the entire area between Colaba Causeway and Apollo Bandar, the gateway of India, and the entire strip along the sea up to Radio Club is entirely reclaimed. All these buildings stand on reclaimed land in that area. What happened was that canny businessmen like Jamshedji Tata and the various Maharajas and Nawabs of Gujarat realized this was a good opportunity to invest. And they began to buy up land and build these large, handsome buildings with big windows, high ceilings. Their target audience was really the new middle-class Britisher who was entering the country not as a soldier, not as an administrator, but for business. The British themselves really looked down on this class, but they needed homes. And so all these structures were built. Interestingly, however, it was the Indian middle class that made the most of it and started arriving in big numbers to stay in these buildings, leaving their community enclaves around the city. And in a way, that is the canvas upon which a very multicultural society emerged, a real patchwork society. This is a building that I know well. It is Sargent House. It is where the poet Dom Moraes lived, where the actress Leela Naidu lived, where members of my family lived. It was a building with people from every community. And it's a similar story across Colaba. In other parts of Colaba, other structures, this money was going into building beautiful structures. And this is Afghan church. And as we are running out of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but Afghan church was built actually as a memorial to the first Indo-Afghan war. The British were absolutely panic-stricken that Russia was eyeing India. So as a preemptive move, they decided to march into Afghanistan. They went there and they kind of got stuck because they really were not able to deal with the tribals and the tribal conflict. After a few years, they decided to retreat, and the kings agreed to give them safe passage. About a procession of 16,000 people was leaving Kabul. They had to cross a pass in the Hindu Kush, which was 5 miles long and so narrow that we are told that light never penetrates, never in that pass. It was when this train of people was in that pass that the Ghilzai tribal struck. There was a massacre. The women were all taken away to various harems, the women and children. A handful of Indian foot soldiers survived and one officer survived. And there is a really famous painting of this officer sort of staggering into India. I really wish I had put it here, but I didn't. But you must look it up. Anyway, so this is a memorial to the people who died in the Afghan war. So if you ever step into church, turn around and look at the back wall, you will see the names. Unfortunately, only of the British officers, but those were the times. The other place that was built that I want to talk about it in some little length is Sassoon-Dock. Sassoon-Dock was built, okay, so after the war happened, after the American Civil War happened, people had thought that this bubble of prosperity would last forever, and they were investing in huge reclamation schemes. And if you look at the number of reclamation companies that were floated at that point, it's incredible. Every corner of the city was planning to reclaim. People were sort of investing in all kinds of odd deals and schemes. The bubble burst. A lot of millionaires became paupers. But Bombay was a lucky city. Something happened in a part of the world that we've all been watching with much interest in the last week. The Suez Canal was built. Overnight, the journey from London to India became much shorter, especially because they did not have to round the Cape of Good Hope. They did not have to go around Africa. They could just sail across the canal. And so Bombay became the obvious port rather than Calcutta. And Bombay's prosperity multiplied. Bombay had very little port and harbour facilities. And so the Sassoons built a familiar landmark, Sassoon Dock. Our fish market was at that point one of the main ports of the city. But that was for a very short time. Soon bigger ports had to be built because of the traffic that was flooding the city. But this is around the time that the 3 lighthouses were built, that Sassoon Dock was built, that a larger port was built. Sassoon Dock became a trooping dock. And one of the soldiers who entered Sassoon Dock at that point was Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was a man who had struck deals all his life. So he was not actually a soldier, but he had come along with a battalion. In Sassoon Dock, they had a peculiar arrangement. When they got off the ships, they went into little boats. The boats would reach the dock. There were iron rings on the dock. And as the tide went up, you had to grab the ring and quickly climb up. Problem. Winston Churchill was grabbing the ring when the tide suddenly receded and he dislocated his shoulder. What happened was not a major thing for a man who was willing to be a soldier, but he was on his way to Sudan, where he was part of a war, a small battle. Now, the British, being the British, were very supercilious and thought that they were impervious to any these black men would never do anything to them. So a large bunch of the British soldiers only carried their swords. They didn't carry rifles. Because Winston Churchill had a dislocated shoulder, he carried his rifle, and he was one of the few soldiers, British, who survived. There was a massacre, and all the British soldiers largely died, except him. And one really, really wonders what would have happened in World War II if Winston Churchill had had a healthy shoulder and, like all his friends and colleagues, had just carried a sword. Something to think about. There's another little detail that I forgot. Before Colaba started becoming wealthy, a couple of developments had occurred at the very tip. There was the lunatic asylum, there was the cemetery where the shipwreck victims were buried, and there was the Colaba Observatory. The observatory was something that the British took very seriously, and they used to record geomagnetic readings. Because of that, no Colaba residents were allowed to use iron in their day-to-day life, and electricity was denied in the city all the way up to 1907. It was only allowed when a duplicate observatory was built in Alibag. This observatory was sort of dismantled. The geomagnetic element of it was dismantled. And that is when electricity and the electric trams were allowed to come into Colaba. Alibag, on its part, was only given electricity in the 1950s. And as I write in my book, it's very interesting to look at the alternative realities that may have been if it had not been for a certain bureaucratic decision or the other. Okay. So a lot of the money that came into Colaba naturally and into Bombay went into building all the landmarks that we see in the Colaba that we know and love. The first, one of the earliest structures was the Watson Hotel, a bastion of white supremacy and white pride and white social life. It was the place that anyone came and stayed, including Mark Twain. And I don't have the time, but if any of you, you can just Google, it's free online. Please do read his account of staying in the Watson Hotel. And his absolutely beautiful paragraph on the crows of Bombay. It is one of my favorite bits of writing about Bombay. I love this photograph because it shows us what that Bombay must have been. So imagine staring at the Watson Hotel, which is now in a disgraceful situation with netting and stuff. But if you look, there's almost nothing that you can see. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor when I move it, but I'm moving it. And here you can see the Regal Circle and the little fountain that we can see buried sort of hidden in the middle of a load of traffic. And here we can see, of course, the Alfred Siemens Rest. So a number of structures were getting built at this point. There was the Yacht Club, which was another bastion of the white European world, another place where no Indians dared step. And there is this infuriating story of this Parsi gentleman who had a European wife, and perhaps to curry favor, he made a gift of a billiards table to the Yacht Club. But even then, he was never allowed to step in. And any of the novels you read in those days, you'll read about the teas that were held on the lawns of Yacht Club. Now, this is the old Yacht Club. The Yacht Club that we know today is the residential annex. This has been taken over by the Department of Atomic Energy. But the next time you go to Gateway of India, stand facing Gateway of India, look to the left, and you will see the beautiful lawns. Tea time was a time for irritable memsahibs to be cribbing about the natives. The night was a time of little dances and little romances, not all within legitimate couples. And in fact, the ships passing were given strict instructions not to shine their spotlights, because you just never knew whose husband and whose wife you might suddenly uncover. So yes, and the Yacht Club, in a sense, was really the center of British social life in Bombay. A lot of the Bombay was at that point was zooming up. This is Majestic Hotel with its famous jazz band and its huge lounge of potted plants. This is Waterloo Mansion. I love the story of a particular resident of Waterloo Mansion, the Mr. Jacobs, but I won't be able to tell it now because it's not, I'm cheating when I tell you that story. It's not a proper Colaba story, so I will skip it sadly, very heartbrokenly. This, of course, is the museum, like Gateway of India, designed by George Whitted. Whitted was a famous architect of the city, and I have special affection for him because when I was in Times of India, I got a phone call from a bunch of medical students from KEM Hospital. They were celebrating their centenary, I think, and they had realized that Whitted had designed KEM. They realized that he had died in Bombay. And they became curious about what happened to him and where he was buried. So they actually found his grave in Sivri Cemetery, and we did an entire story about Whitted and his grave in Sivri, and they redid his grave, did a little railing. And it's quite amazing that a man who's contributed a lot of structures, I think over 100, to our city, including the Museum and Gateway of India, is such a forgotten figure. Admittedly, he was not very pleased about the museum. He wanted to do a proper colonial, traditional structure, classical structure. But the Mr. Moneybags demanded that he do a mix of Oriental and sort of traditional British, traditional European structure. And I'm really glad they did, because I don't know how you all feel, but for me, the museum is one of the, the pearls of our city. It just makes me happy to look at it whenever I pass. So we have this entire circle around the Regal Circle. There's Waterloo Mansion, there's Majestic Hotel, which is now Sakari Bhandar, and the MLA Hostel. There's the Institute of Science, there's the museum. And there was one remaining plot of land which had a cannon, which used to be fired very irregularly when major VIPs came. They decided to do away with the cannon, and Regal Cinema was built, in a way flagging off the Art Deco movement of Colaba. And there are just magnificent stories about Regal Cinema, about Rabindranath Tagore reciting his poetry on the stage, about Gregory Peck peeping in to see how his movie was doing, and about the excitement of the underground parking lot and the soda fountain and the elevator and the air conditioning. So it really, really was the place to go. And in fact, I am a children's and young adults writer, and my new book is set partly in the Bombay of the 1930s. And Regal plays a big role because the girl is a movie buff. So for me, Regal is, a place that I always, again, look at with affection when I pass. A lot of the remaining parts of Colaba, like Nathalal Parekh Marg with Woodhouse Cathedral, were also developed at this point. There is a delightful story about Woodhouse Cathedral. The Archbishop was upset because the little chapel at Meadows Street was becoming very crowded, was very hot, and so people had stopped going for service. And he felt that religion was really suffering, so he demanded a plot of land in this newly created part of the city. The Bombay City Improvement Trust first offered him a plot of land where where BST, is today, where the horse-drawn trams had their stables and their godowns. The Archbishop was furious and said it would be obnoxious to build a place of worship next to a stable full of horses. It would be smelly and it would be noisy. So he fought and finally got a number of handsome plots of land, and where the Church of Holy Name is today. And if any of you do pass Holy Name, try and see if you can find Judith with the dismembered head and Saint John and the dragon. They are my favorite parts of the cathedral. And of course, the bell named Pauline. You can hear her clanging through the day. This is another part of Nathalal Parekh Marg, Shone House, and our very own Bhoot Bangla. Again, I went to the school and our junior school used to be here. Sadly, the ghosts weren't very active then. Let's hope they are more alert and adventurous ghosts now. Again, Colaba had another big change in the 1920s when the powers that be realized that it was really impractical to keep the cotton green in Colaba. By this point, Bombay had its own mills. They were in Parel and Dadar and further north. The port had moved. So they realized that they were bringing cotton all the way to the southern tip of the city, only then to move it all the way. So they decided to move the cotton green. And again, Colaba was blessed by swathes of empty land and a number of buildings like Kulsum Terrace along the causeway were then built. Again, most of them Art Deco. This was the jazz age, and these were the bylanes that I think resounded with jazz. And there are again some marvelous stories about the jazz musicians who came to the city, many from Goa, others from other parts of the world. And my friend Naresh's book, Taj Mahal Foxtrot, has some amazing, delightful stories about musicians who manage life in a one-bedroom Colaba apartment with 3 grand pianos and a bunch of trumpets and flutes and God knows what else is. And probably some family members squeezed into a kitchen as well. This was the time of war. And Colaba during the wars was a party place. They used to shut the causeway for traffic and the soldiers used to party the nights away. It was also a bit of a racy place with Mildreds from England and Natashas from various Eastern European corners of the world gathering here for little dalliances and little businesses of various kinds. So Colaba had developed quite a reputation, including one for being a very good place to stock up on your pawn supply. After the war, Colaba witnessed, was, I think, the proud home of the naval uprising, which was one of the factors, some of the Indian Navy members sort of rose in anger because they felt that they had been treated very badly during World War II. And it's an incredible story because the city came to a standstill. The various unions around the city supported them with absolute energy. And these naval not soldiers, but the naval, they were called, they had a particular word, whatever. They grabbed a bunch of ships, they took over, and they aimed the cannons at the yacht club, at the Taj Mahal Hotel, and at the strip of buildings along Apollo Bandar. So it was a very tense few days, and it is actually the backdrop of Salman Rushdie's Moa's Last Sigh, a big chunk of it is set against this. Very interesting. This is a monument to the naval uprising, but it is interesting that it is a chapter of history that, though so important, and a fact that it is definitely something that prompted the British to leave when they did. We don't hear about it much because, in a way, it is one blot on our otherwise non-violent movement, and it was something that upset the powers that be a lot. But Colaba was the home of it. And of course, Colaba played another major role when the British finally left India, because the absolute last of the British soldiers and Navy officers left from under the gateway of India. And there is a beautiful video, very strangely stirring and moving, that is on YouTube, of the British leaving. And I highly recommend you take a look at it if you can. I didn't attach it here because it was just too long. I think I will end here. The new lands, again, ushered in people from all over. I think Colaba is spectacular and wonderful because it is truly a mosaic. Through its history, you will read about Armenians, about Japanese, about people from China, there were, of course, the Sindhis who came, and a little Sindh that is now in Colaba. There is the little Arabia, and there are little corners of the city that bear testament to its very multinational, welcoming, tolerant, and happy past. And in a way that remains.
So let me address the questions. With your permission, we can go on to the questions. Two people have asked, would you have any further information about the 5 dargahs in Navy Nagar, which are believed to date back to the pre-Portuguese era? Do you have any information about that? I know you've referred to them briefly in your book.
Well, so I did do a bunch of research. It is very difficult. They claim that they are 11th century dargahs. What we do know about Colaba is that there was a village over there at the tip near where US Club is today and where the dargahs are today, which was predominantly Muslim. It is interesting because before the British and the Portuguese eyed Bombay, before they stepped in, Bombay was, of course, a territory that was ruled by a series of rulers who ruled this part of the world, and Bombay was a very insignificant part of it. They did not lose any sleep over it, but it was part of their kingdom. Towards the end, it was ruled by one of the Nawabs of Gujarat. And I spoke to an academician who has done a lot of research about the Muslim roots of Bombay. At that point, it seems that before the Portuguese came, it was the system to grant bundles of land from his kingdom to people who had done good deeds for him. So so probably a chunk of Colaba land and a chunk of land across Bombay, in fact, chunks were granted to people, to various upstanding Gujarati citizens. Presumably many of them were Muslim. It seems very likely that at least that many of these tombs belonged to these rich landowners, and then there were these fancy tombs over there. So slowly stories and fables started going around them. Now, the one tomb that I did visit was very clear that it was a tomb of a saint from Baghdad, and that he had come in the 11th century. The stories do, I mean, in a way, coincide with the story of Haji Ali. So it's not absolutely impossible that some of them really were from Baghdad. But of course, not all of them. Some seem to have been rich landowners. And many accounts of early Colaba at that point talk about a very strong Muslim presence. So, yeah.
You mentioned in your book about the Moore's tomb, and you also mentioned it today, John Moore's, John Child's tomb.
Yes.
Hamza, Nazneen Hamza, one of our regular attendees, wants to know if there's any documentation on the Mohammedan community in the area around the Musalman tomb.
Unfortunately, nothing that I could find. I have actually the academician that I know, he is in the US, and he's done an entire PhD thesis on the rest of the city. So it's not very Colaba centric. He's looking more around Mahim and stuff. And we were actually supposed to go for a walk together. And then unfortunately the pandemic struck and he went off to the US in one of those last flights, taking American citizens home at that point. But he has promised to come back. And I would be very happy if you come along and we sort of discover that area together.
Would love to. In fact, that is what Saz Agarwal says. She would love to walk around Colaba with you.
Anytime.
Going back to the questions, can one visit the lighthouses around Colaba?
I'm sorry?
Can one visit the lighthouses around Colaba?
I have only been once to the rather boring one near Apollo Bandar. But, I keep reading articles about how the government is planning to open it up to tourism. And I suspect they would allow, because they did allow Times of India journalists at that point. So I think, it seems to be a long-standing plan of theirs to open it as a tourist attraction, especially Tom's Lighthouse would be magnificent. And it's something it's really on my cards. So again, it's something I'm hoping to pursue soon enough. So,
you mentioned in the early part of your talk that Bombay was beautiful and still lots of Britishers died. So there was a question about that being contradictory. I explained it that it could be the climate which did the people in. Is there anything further that you'd like to add?
The disease and the debauchery, apparently the level of drinking was quite crazy. Maybe they were bored, but there is a very interesting book which talks about the various pubs in 18th and 19th century Bombay, India actually, but there's a huge chunk devoted to Bombay. And it seems to have been a most swinging place, just incredibly. Not Colaba so much, but Bombay itself. And I think the lifestyle here was really quite crazy. They were also very into the local women. So I think that also contributed in some ways and that is why Colaba, because it was so tucked away that you really could not party that much. That is why the lifespan of the people, the army and the navy guys in Colaba was so much better. And possibly explains it. But yeah.
Okay. History buffs know of the Armenian lane on the main Bombay island. Is there any Colaba connection with Armenians?
There were a lot of Armenians living here in Colaba, but no, their main landmarks and stuff were in Bombay Island. But there are the Armenians that crop up. There's the bandit who took away coachmen here.
You mentioned that in your book.
Yes, Vinod Mehta, his biography is also a lovely read, and he actually stayed in Buckley Court. Today, Buckley Court is a fancy, expensive building, but the old Buckley Court was an Indo-Saracenic sort of structure, very dear to me because that is where I had to stand to wait for my brother. When I left Fort Convent School, I would wait there with other Fort Convent girls, and all the Campion boys would then come clod hopping to meet their sisters and whichever girls they were going home with. And we would all stand near Buckley Court and we were convinced it was haunted and there were shadows. Vinod Mehta stayed there. It was a disreputable guest house. And he talks about this Armenian family over there that was planning a coup in Turkey, among the other colorful characters he stayed with. So, yeah, there seemed to have been a lot of Armenians, Japanese, a famous Japanese shoe shop, a Japanese restaurant, a Japanese hotel.
Okay.
A lot of people.
I remember the corner that you'd mentioned in your book, and I remember it because you said that you stood at that corner and tried to take a shortcut to your house, only to be assaulted by eccentric Parsi aunties from Kushrabag.
Yes. It was horrendous. They used to throw eggs and tomatoes at my brother and me. And my brother thought it was a wonderful game. And I was miserable and mortified and always landed up home with a bruised knee and a really bruised ego because they would call us things like rascal jiva chokra. And I really minded. I was like an elegant teenager. I didn't want to be a rascal jiva chokra.
I hope your new neighbors are better. Okay, I'm just scrolling through the comments. I'm going to read this out verbatim because it's slightly confusing. In the Mumbai lands, like in Colaba, was given to Gujarati people by the Sultan, then what happened to the ownership between Muslim Gujarati to Portuguese rule and then to English rule? Did they lose their ownership?
You see, what happened was the Nawab of Gujarat did something really stupid. He joined hands with the Portuguese. He was having like an ego issue with the Mughals. So he decided the Portuguese were the way to go. He joined hands with the Portuguese and handed over to the Portuguese his entire, everything Salt set south. So everything was handed over to the Portuguese. There are no records of what actually happened, but we do know that the Portuguese took over vast swathes of land and made it their own. Whether they paid, whether they grabbed, it's difficult to know. Whether they struck a financial deal where they took some land and the Indians kind of worked for them, it's difficult to know. But what we do know is that while there is that strong Colaba route, Muslim route, is not that visible anymore. When you see, there is of course a Colaba, there is a Muslim population, there are the dargahs, there are the masjids, but that huge connect seems to have gone.
Correct. Lots of compliments about your books, lots of compliments about your talks, which we'll be happy to share with you afterwards. People living in Colaba and in TIFR says that it's been a wonderful experience to know the history. Himangi says, can you throw a little light on why we have two buildings? I guess the answer to that, short answer to that, is two different buildings in two different eras.
Sorry, two different buildings?
Two different buildings, she's asking. Why are there two different buildings? I suppose the short answer to that is two different eras in which they were built.
Yes, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. They reflect the age that they were built in and the mood.
Alhad Kothari wanted to know if this talk is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube. Not right now, possibly later. Lots of compliments, super talk. Thanks. And let me go back to the questions and see if we've taken most of them. Yes, Commander Mohan Narayan is a Navy veteran. He wants to know where you've got your reference for the details of Mendham's Point. As a naval historian, he's into documentation a lot, so he'd love to know.
I'm sorry, Mendham's Point. So yes. A lot of the information about Mendham's Point is in John Burnell's letters to his father. That's one of the original sources. There is the Times of India article of the 1920s also. Mendham's Point is mentioned in Samuel Shepherd's Bombay, in the books of S.M. Edwards, virtually in many, many books about the city. Ovington's letters, Ovington's diary, Henry Moses, I think probably Henry Moses. So the back of my book has a long bibliography. You could go through it. And, there's one thing I want to say. If anybody is researching old Bombay, there is a really wonderful source that I found, archives.org. And the Times of India directories over there. This was pre-phone. So the Times of India directories were an incredible resource that used to actually talk building by building. They would take a lane and actually refer to each building and give the name of the building, the name of the people living there, the name of the shops and restaurants there, and the actual occupation of each person living there. It is fascinating. It's a real snapshot of the city. And something, so when I'm writing my book set in the 1930s, for me, it's invaluable because I know the kind of people who will live there. I know the shops that my character will shop at. I know the dry cleaner she will give her clothes to. I know the cake shop she will buy her pastries from. So it is a wonderful resource for anyone trying to get a picture of Bombay 100 years ago.
Yes, I was going to mention the bibliography at the end of your book. I think it spans into 5 pages. Really? That's quite a telling comment on the amount of research that you must have put into it. Last 2 observations, unless more come in. Commander Mohan Narayan again, the railway line was extended from Churchgate to Colaba in 1873, he points out. By which time possibly the cotton boom may have ended, or actually had ended.
So, so there are waves of the cotton boom, right? Yeah. So the huge cotton boom had ended, of course, but the Suez Canal had opened and Bombay had become the heart of cotton export from India to the rest of the world, primarily Britain. It was much more convenient than Calcutta, right? Because cotton came from Gujarat, from Rajasthan, so it was very convenient. And in fact, a lot that we see around us is connected with the cotton boom. Majestic Hotel was a place where cotton traders came to stay. That's why it was built. Watson Hotel was also a place where all these businessmen came. So the railways, the railways, see what was happening was they did a survey and they realized, I have the number in my book, but I'm not very good with remembering figures. The railways actually did a study and they found that an incredible number of bullock carts was traveling across Bombay into Bombay, just carrying cotton. And then going back all the way. So partly it was to cut down on that bullock traffic that the railways built. And I think we as human beings, we all tend to imagine the world will continue as it is today. We can't imagine massive change. So I can imagine those guys saying, Arey, cotton is doing so well, Suez Canal has been built, people will always want cotton from us. Let us have the trains come in. And then of course the railways, once the cotton green went, and the Back Bay Reclamation Scheme came, the railways really came in the way. The Back Bay Reclamation Scheme was a very ambitious scheme. They were planning, and it kind of died partly because it ran out of money, but some land was reclaimed and the railways and the tracks were removed to allow for that reclamation.
Is the Times of India directory available online?
Yes, archives.org.
Okay. And let me look again. Questions seem to keep on and on. Okay, this is a question from when you were talking about the ships turning around the peninsula and passing the John Child's tomb on the left. Indrani wants to know, why did the British not use the shorter route? The Portuguese route had to enter the harbour. That is via the creek separating Bombay Island from Canara Island in Fryer's map.
Right. So why didn't they use a short? Well, I think the plan is always to approach from that side, but sometimes the boat, you see, I mean, it was tricky, right? If you came this way, if you hit Bombay, if you read some of the letters of the sailors at that point, it's quite interesting because there are multiple instructions about how you approach the Bombay harbour. It was obviously something that they spent a lot of energy about. So if you were lucky and the winds allowed you to enter the harbour directly, that was perfect. But sometimes you ended up on the other side, at which point you had to turn around, go around Proms, and then approach Apollo Bandar. So it is at that point that the tombs and the 7 trees and some coconut trees of Malabar Hill became absolutely critical, a matter of life and death.
Can you, Shabnam, hear at night the ship still turning the harbour?
Yes.
Turning into the harbour?
Can't you? Yes.
I can too, yes. So that's a nice little continuity of history. Absolutely. And I'm particularly fascinated by your theory that the Vadnu jar, which stands between our homes, would have been on the property of the lady who danced with the Duke of Wellington.
Mrs. Huff. So Mrs. Huff was General Boddington's daughter. General Boddington being the first Colaba chore that we know about, encroached land. Fought a court case, gave land to his daughter, and that land is actually really famous because there was a very famous mango tree there that every Britisher obsessed about because they were obsessed with mangoes. This mango tree gave mangoes not only in May, but also at Christmas time. So imagine mangoes at Christmas. So Mrs. Huff was famous. She was a beauty in her time. She danced with the famous soldiers who visited Bombay, and she had this mango tree. And she sold her land to the railways. They built the Colaba station, which is now today Badwar Park, and Farooq and I, being neighbors as we are, I could not find the mango tree. I went and spoke to the Malis of Badwar Park, and they pinned me down as a total Colaba loony. And there are many of us. But our banyan tree, I think I'm convinced that it met Mrs. Huff, that it knew the creek before Mrs. Huff came along, that it saw Colaba station. And I don't know, talk to it, it will tell you stories.
Yes. And it's now the home for many, many birds in the morning and owls in the night.
Yeah.
Yes. I think absolutely the last question. Ashwin says that he's read that the leftover doors and windows from the Taj Mahal palace were used in the construction of Majestic Hotel. He's heard the story.
I think Majestic came before that
No,
or around the
no,
same
no, no.
time. I don't know.
In the same decade though, but
but around the same time. I'm not sure. I haven't read about that. I don't know.
okay.
So
Shabnam, thank you very much for a most interesting talk. I think a lot of people have said that they will go and get the book or read it as soon as possible. People have said that their daughters are fans of your book, of your series of books. Thank you, everybody, and do keep on attending as many talks as you can, and keep on watching us on social media. Thank you. Thank you, Shabnam.
bye.